Hi, this is Judy Paparosi. I'm an adjunct professor at UNC Pembroke, and I teach primarily criminal justice courses. I'm a lawyer, and I also have a master's in education. But I basically teach human trafficking almost every semester pretty much, since I've been at UNC Pembroke since 2007. I started teaching it in 2010, and I came off of a 31-year career, both full-time and part-time, for the last few years when I had kids in criminal justice in 3 states. I worked in prisons in New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. And then I went to law school and I became a prosecutor. And then I became a local prosecutor when my kids were born. And then I was also a public defender and a criminal defense attorney. But in my career, my years working in criminal justice took me from juvenile probation into prisons. I worked for the prison system for almost 14, 15 years. I worked in 3 different states in the prisons in New Mexico, as I said, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. I worked also after I became a lawyer as a prosecutor. My specialty was narcotics cases. And then when I had children, I left a full-time practice of law and became a criminal defense attorney, but I also worked as a local prosecutor and a local public defender. So I've basically been in every aspect of the criminal justice system. I've been in police stations for many years, working as a local and county prosecutor. I worked in the courts as a prosecutor, trying cases, especially drug cases, which I specialized in, as I mentioned. And I also worked in juvenile probation, so after prison, but I did parole release for many years for the New Jersey State Parole Board. In all of the crimes I've been exposed to, human trafficking is the worst one. The reason it's the worst one is it's because it's a combination of several crimes. Obviously, we're talking about rape. We're also talking about assault. We could be talking about murder. We could be talking about kidnapping, all combined into one, and we're selling another human being whose life has absolutely no value to us. Dr. Norman kindly asked me to talk to your class in a discussion post about female violence against females and the intersection with human trafficking. And it was a topic that I've talked about many times, but hadn't especially concentrated on why these things lead to human trafficking, although now that I've done the research for this little talk, I can explain why more. And by the way, before I forget, on March 23rd, UNC Pembroke will offer its annual Human Trafficking Conference, and this year we'll be looking at the impact of human trafficking on the indigenous cultures and communities, specifically the Native American communities. And I'll have members of the Arapaho tribe, our Lumbee nation here, as well as a Santee Sioux woman speaking and another expert on human trafficking. But I have 4 women speaking, and I'm really excited about it. It's virtual. It begins at 9 a.m. And you can write to me at judith.paparosi@uncp.edu for registration information. And you'll start seeing it around the campus on February 1st. And it'll be sent out to a lot of the professors to send to you as well. So let's take a look at female gendercide and human trafficking. And there is an enormous intersection between the two. First of all, human trafficking is one of the greatest and worst forms of violence, the worst forms, greatest number and worst forms of violence against women and girls. 2/3 of our trafficking victims have been identified as females, whether it's a woman or a girl. And there is a preference for younger and younger victims. And that's another talk for another day as we talk solely about sex trafficking. But traffickers use, of course, intimidation to subdue their victims. They may use psychological techniques, they may use drugs, or they may use absolute coercion. The coercion that they may use are things like, as I said, drugs, but they may also use violence, which they often do. And it's not only physical, but it's mental abuse. And if you ever take my class, we can go over all these things. But as I mentioned, the extreme abuse that they use includes some type of imprisonment. I refer to it as kidnapping, forced abortions, a physical brutality at the hands of their traffickers. And sadly, the life expectancy of a woman who is sex trafficked, is 7 years. She will die within 7 years. For children, the number's a little lower, according to UNICEF. And what does she do? What happens with the victim is that they're completely isolated by their traffickers. They're sold 20 to 30 times a day. It doesn't really matter because all the trafficker cares about is making as much money as he can off the woman. And the only way this crime can be stopped is what you're doing today. You're listening to me, somebody who has an expertise in human trafficking, talking about it. So we need to start with prevention. And the best prevention is education for us in this country. And that's why I also talk about social media and its impact on human trafficking, because we have tremendous exposure to the criminal element of our world right now. And it's through this, our beloved cell phones, and of course our computers. We also need to know how traffickers operate. Again, that's a conversation for another day. But this violence against women impacts us all, and it impacts all society. You know, women are the key to keeping families together, which keeps communities together, which keeps the world together. It keeps society together. And trafficking cuts all that off. So it does enormous damage. And we don't even know, because this crime wasn't around when I was a prosecutor in New Jersey in the 90s and the early 2000s, in the 80s too. It wasn't around. It wasn't on our books. We didn't think slavery existed on the scale that it exists in the world today. And I've heard estimates from anywhere from 14 million to 21 million people are enslaved. And if women are 2/3 of that, you can do the math. There are millions of women and girls enslaved around the world today. And let's talk about two examples, because Dr. Norman said to talk from 20 to 30 minutes. I'll probably keep it around 25 minutes. So, India has reported that over 63 million women are missing from its population. And this was in 2018. And China, we're going to talk about China as well, which is a country I definitely talk about a lot in my class. China has similar numbers missing. Where are they? So 2 million women disappear annually in India due to abortions, many of them forced, diseases, neglect, and human trafficking. The trafficking of women and girls in India is particularly widespread and is perpetuated by significant gender imbalances, the societal preference for males, which I'll explain in a few minutes why that happens. That leads to sex selection abortions, which are extremely high in India, of all countries other than China, extremely high. Like they'll have 15 abortions just to get one son. And there's a demand for girls and women because there are so few of them. There are 37 million more men in India than in women. How do they get married? How do men get married? Well, somebody else has to get abused because they want that son. And I'll explain what it means in China. I'm not as sure as what this means in India with this cultural preference for males, but I know what it's all about in China. Other factors, of course, and these are very relevant around the world, are things like poverty, lack of education, and lack of an access to education, which is critical. If you don't have an access to education, you may only be allowed to go to the 3rd grade or not allowed to go at all if you're a girl. This permanently damages your future and your life. And there's a lack of job opportunities for women. Law enforcement, mainly a male profession in these countries, is inadequate. And all of these create the ideal situation for human trafficking to flourish. There's an NGO. An NGO is a non-governmental organization. So I'm going to use that term a lot, a non-government or governmental organization. It's called the Invisible Girl Project. And I believe it's by 2 Americans, but they could be from somewhere else, a lawyer and her husband. And they combat human trafficking and murder of these girls, focusing on the preventative aspect. And that's my specialty because I'm not in the field anymore. I did 31 years in the field. Now I'm content at my age, 68, to just be in the classroom and doing conferences, as I've done since 2015 at this wonderful university I teach at UNC Pembroke. So this Invisible Girl Project is an NGO that tries to break this cycle of discrimination that leads to this tragic practice of what we call female gendercide. And I'll define that in a few minutes. But what is it? It is the systematic killing of girls and women for many different reasons. So it's the death of females worldwide due to the following: sex selection abortions, as I mentioned, to favor a boy over a girl, particularly bad in China. Female infanticide, where the girl is killed, and believe me, I wouldn't say it if it weren't true. Female infanticide. the gross neglect of girls because of the cultural preference for boys, the entirely preventable maternal death, and the inability of older women who are maybe widowed to access food and shelter, and a socially sanctioned violence against women, those honor crimes that you hear of in some countries, etc. This wonderful NGO, the Innocent Girl, excuse me, the Invisible Girl Project, based in India, it tries to work upstream to prevent the murder, to prevent the trafficking before it happens, because it has identified as that female gendercide is the root cause of human trafficking in India. Same thing in China. So the Invisible Girl Project is committed to addressing this issue of female gendercide in India. And so what they've decided to do is, in order to prevent this systematic elimination of women and girls, they intervene early on. They'll go over to the house and say to the mother who's pregnant, you know, girls have value. They do the same thing in China. These organizations do the same thing in China. They're trying to prevent the lives that these girls face from the womb all through life because of the societal thinking about this. They try to prevent them from being trafficked into child marriage, which is very big in both these countries, India that we're talking about, and China. They try to keep them out of the sex trade. Well, how do they do it? They've rescued 900 girls in the few years they've been around. Maybe I think they've been around about 10 years at this point. They've been able to rescue 900 girls with a threefold strategy. The first one is called RICE, RICE, which is rescue, intervention, care, and empowerment. So what they do is they identify girls who are potentially going to be aborted. You know, of course, I don't know that they know that, but going to be subject to sex selection abortion. They talk to the moms who are pregnant, or female infanticide. They're killed upon them being born because they're not a guy, they're not a boy, or child trafficking. They ensure the woman's safety, the girl's safety, by intervening within the family, like I said, and the community. And then these girls are given the key thing: care, education, and support, especially education. They're taught, they're sent to schools, or school education is given to them, and they're given a trade to empower them. Now they have a shot at a future in India. The second strategy after rights, which is rescue, intervention, care, and empowerment. The second one is teaching and transforming. So now we go out, and this organization goes out and works on training key members of the community, the police, healthcare workers, school teachers, etc., on factors that contribute to all these problems, and specifically female gendercide, its causes, and tries to show them ways of empowering these organizations to help with the females, to take proactive measures to reduce the occurrence of female gendercide. And another egregious, so that's India. So, the third thing is they raise, I'm sorry, I forgot. The third of the threefold strategy of this Invisible Girl Project is to raise global awareness. And so this NGO consults with the UN and advises the UN on how to bring an end to the discrimination against girls and women and the societal issues that they deal with in the country of India. And that's, if you want to read any more about that or support this organization, you can go to invisiblegirlproject.org. Another country that I deal with a lot in my human trafficking class is China. Now, for many years, China had two things that you need to know about. One, it has a cultural preference for males. But there's a reason why, and I don't know the India's reason as well as I do China's reason, because I teach China in my human trafficking class during the semester. So number one, as I said, there's a cultural preference for males. It's interesting to note that not every country has what we have here in the United States: retirement, Social Security. We can put away money that we are not taxed on now in order to pay the taxes while we are retired and not earning as much money. So we have all these things set up, 501c3s, not 501c3s. We have all these things like 401ks set up so that we can provide for ourselves for retirement. In China, it's not like that. The government gives nothing, no Medicare, no Social Security, nothing. So when a man and his wife retire if she works, if they both retire, they must go live with their son's family. It is a shame, which is forbidden to be ashamed in a Chinese society, to live with your daughter's family. I hope that's changing. So that's the one thing. There's a cultural preference for males. But on top of that, back in the 70s or early 80s, the country imposed, because of a population, according to its government and its officials, an overpopulation. So they imposed a one-child policy. But don't forget, there's a cultural preference for males. So the one child you want to have is a male. But what if you have a male and there are no females to marry your future son or the son that you're going to have? So this created an enormous female gendercide, both while the woman is pregnant, after the baby is born, and to this day. China finally woke up in 2017, I believe, and changed it to a two-child policy. And in 2021, realizing it would take generations, not just decades, but generations to fix the problems caused by this one-child policy and the cultural preference for male. It is now a three-child policy. But the rest of this continues, and it's not getting any better. So now there's an enormous demographic crisis in China that rises to the level of female gendercide. Women in China are bought and sold, they're murdered, they're made to disappear in order to comply with a governmental policy with the cultural phenomenon of male child preference. As of about 2010, demographers, those are people who calculate how many people live there, what the demographics of an area are, there are about 50 to 100 million missing women that should have either been born or survived a pregnancy, gone, killed, gone, just completely gone. Given the scarcity of women, gangs then started to specialize in working to kidnap and sell women as brides in China. And North Korea, with Kim Jong-un as its dictator, fully cooperates in selling his women who displease him to Chinese men. So what has happened in China is an absolute tragedy. First of all, there's social pressure to have that male child, and it's definitely preferred. There is also that zealous enforcement of the one child, then two child policy, and now three child policy by the government. And there's also, for those ordinary Chinese people, there's a murderous response, they say, to this policy undertaken by millions of ordinary Chinese people who are desperate to have that son. They need that son in order to have a normal life when they retire. A recent Chinese census reported that there's 121 boys born for 100 girls. So that, and the global average is 105 or 106 boys to every girl. So China has the highest disparate rate in the world in favor of the males over the females. And experts have said that this disparity is linked to the practice of either aborting females who are unborn, killing female babies upon their birth. And right now there's an estimate 30 to 40 more men than women living in China. And those men, and this is critical, you have to concentrate on this, they're called surplus males. So what those surplus males, now remember, they have to produce an heir, a male heir. So what do? They marry foreign brides like the North Korean women that I mentioned, or women from Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, etc. But they don't honor them, as they are only a baby maker again. And then once she makes that male heir, he could care less if she lived or died. She's discarded or treated very poorly or enslaved in the household because he has bought her. It's a arranged marriage. She doesn't want to do it. She may have been sold by another government to this family or whatever to produce that male heir. Because remember, there are 30 to 40 million more men than women. So all those men, those surplus males, need brides in order to carry on what Chinese believe is something that must be done. So what has this gender imbalance caused? In addition to surplus males and the murder of so many of unborn girls as well as babies. Again, all of these can be proven. Of course, there's an increase in prostitution. There's an increase in human trafficking in China. Sex trafficking involves forms that we may not see everywhere in the world. The purchase of women just for brides, the purchase of a male son, or the kidnapping of male sons. And we have seen that there are like billboards, not billboards, but poster boards all over the cities of China. My son is missing, and pictures of sons and moms crying, and it's awful. And of course, you can have the sale of unwanted female children if they are allowed to be born. Many men in China desperately, especially in the rural areas, seek these brides anywhere where they can get them. And these men will, as I've repeated now, they'll buy a trafficked woman just to produce that male heir. They'll get married. And sadly, it's been reported that couples seeking a male child, and I'll give you an example in a second, will kill their little girl in order to be able to make room to buy that male boy, that baby boy. It's really heartbreaking. So young women, young girls, young baby girls, whatever, they have no value. And that's what leads to this horrible female gendercide, and one factor that leads to human trafficking. And human trafficking in China, especially with China's president and the dictator in North Korea, Kim Jong-un, they have made China a lucrative business, not only for the criminals, but for the government. And there's with what I told you about the 1 and 2 child policy, now luckily a 3-child policy that has created terrible imbalance. And of course, there's that blind adherence to the social tradition of honoring that male child, my number one son, as they used to say in some movies or whatever. And the government does nothing to protect the women and girls in China. And how do I know this? Because every year my students and I evaluate 10 countries in my class on human trafficking. China is one of them. And every year China has been one of the 3 or 4 worst in the world for its violation of human rights via human trafficking, with North Korea right up there and Russia. They're the lowest ranked countries, tier 3 countries, on an annual report by our government, by the Department of State at the federal level, that evaluates every country in the world, the 175 countries, whatever it is, 179 countries. China's always one of the worst in the world for its human rights violations regarding specifically one crime, human trafficking. So they tried this 2-child policy. That didn't work in 2016. That didn't work, and now they've gone up to a 3-child policy as of 2021. But here is how bizarre this is. When the 2-child policy came in 2016, and people knew they could now, instead of, if they just had a daughter, they could have a son, a woman and a man decided they were going to have a baby so they could have that son, because they only had a girl, and that was going to be a problem, okay? So they knew that. So she got pregnant 4 times. Each time it was a girl, and he forced her to abort all 4 girls. Then she became very ill because the abortions happened in a 12-month period, and she died. So she died trying to give birth to a son because her husband forced this. Now, of course, the husband's thinking, I have to have a male heir. He can't adopt. Where are you going to get a baby in China? You're not going to get it. You're not going to get a male child in China. And what part of the world would be able to provide him with the son that he needs to continue on the Chinese customs and the male preference? The Chinese preference for males. And of course, Chinese shift to a 2 and 3 child policy has not changed the sex selection abortions of little girls, as I mentioned. And now China, as I said, has about a 30 to 40 million, they call these men either surplus males or bare branches, men who will never find wives and will be unable to reproduce and carry on the family line. And that's a big deal when you talk about Chinese culture. And so this alarming gender imbalance and this devaluation of women and the violence against women and female gendercide has led to an enormous problem of human trafficking in China. And even if China were to eliminate all these coercive birth limitations now, even if the cultural son preference was able to magically disappear, and gender ratios at birth would go kind of back to normalize, the effects would never be felt in China for decades and decades, I say generations to come. and it has literally inflicted itself with a wound that it may never get over unless it completely changed. Now, as I mentioned, the government evaluates trafficking in every country of the world once a year, and it's called the TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons Report. And China's policies have brought it to be a tier 3. And it's the cultural preference that I mentioned. It was 117 to 100 girls in China, but it went up to 121 to 100 girls being born in China. And it's just this skewed sex ratio is truly one of the many reasons that there is that there is so much violence, because girls are just not valued. And that so what can you do? What can you do? And I always want to say, what can we do at the end of it? Well, one of the things, you can support these NGOs that work to fix these problems in places like India and China. With governments that are really tough, especially the Chinese government to work under. There's an organization in China called Women's Rights Without Borders, and they have a Save a Child, and they also have a Save a Video, a widow, Save a Widow, because if widows, there's no husband, there's maybe no son, she's basically on her own. She may not be able to work, and she's literally left to die without access to food and health care, etc., because the Chinese government is very oppressive and does not value the woman, does not value the girl, does not value the baby girl. And so she also will suffer, as well as the females in her family. So you can support an organization like the Invisible Girl Project, or you can just do your own research online. Another thing you can do is be careful of what you buy. So you may not want to support things that are made in China, because China's got to feel at some point that the United States really cares about the rights of their females and the violence against women and the cultural preference for males, etc. But there are many things you can do, and if you have any questions about that, you can email me at judith.paparozzi, that's PAPAROZZI at uncp.edu. And remember, you'll learn a lot by coming to my conference virtually. So you'll get the link and you just click on it and you'll be a part of it. I think there were 500 to 600 people last year. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but it seemed like it was pretty high, the registration. And that's on Thursday, March 23rd, and it's free and open to the public, so you can have your family attend, whatever. Especially if you're Native American, this is going to be a particularly wonderful conference, because we're focusing on the Native American, the indigenous cultures and communities. And we have, of course, we're blessed to be at a historically Indian university at UNC Pembroke. But I'd love to have you all come. So thank you for listening. And thank you, Dr. Norman, for this wonderful example to talk about human trafficking and how it impacts us all.